Welcome everyone. My name is Nick Cullen Carroll, and this is a poster presentation of my dissertation, Chapter 2, Literature Review, or how far it's come along now. I'm going to start by giving us a little bit of background information. So my project is going to be trying to validate a readiness or another name preparedness scale, which is similar to a wellness scale. And we're going to try and validate this with high school aged physical education students to use as a tool for understanding where students are each day they come into physical education, and if they're ready to train, if they're ready for a game, or just generally to address some of the standards. So that's a good starting point. Uh, Physical education, what is it? It's a primary subject that addresses physical activity, the knowledge, the performance, as well as the psychological and social characteristics that go along with it. And this is given in kindergarten all the way up through 12th grade. Now, of particular importance is Standard 3 when we're talking about 9th grade through 12th grade physical education. And this states that students can demonstrate psychological and sociological knowledge as it pertains to physical activity, and they can evaluate their psychological responses to physical activity. And I think that's an important characteristic to point out in that standard, evaluating psychological responses. So with that brief amount of background information, let's look at some of the gaps in the research. We do have plenty of wellness studies, perceived wellness studies. And a lot of these studies can indicate an individual's ability to provide meaningful data for mood, fatigue, lack of sleep, well-being, sleep quality, sleep quantity, nutrition quality, muscle readiness, energy levels. These are all factors that we deem appropriate for wellness correlated with that readiness or preparedness factor to perform. We see this in a couple of studies by McGahan in 2019, Kelman in 2010, and Hooper 95, outlining a couple of the theoretical constructs as well as exercising some of the practical scales with different populations. However, and I say this because we are talking about gaps, most of this data exists in older populations, from young adult and then moving upwards. And particularly it exists in elite athletic populations. Not a lot of it exists in what we would term a general or a clinical population. Another factor that seems to be missing is longitudinal data sets. A lot of this exists in short-term studies, which I find interesting because not a lot of them are validation studies. You would think that they do maybe a validity and reliability test on some of these scales over the short term, but we don't really see that. We see short-term data collections and data sets without validations and without reliability calculations. And then a third need is that there needs to be an appropriate scale addressing these characteristics, right? And again, just to repeat, it was readiness and preparedness through a wellness questionnaire. And we need to see this appropriate scale brought up in a high school physical education setting with that population. And by that, appropriate, I mean something valid and something reliable. So that brings us to our problem statement, which is, can wellness questionnaires be issued to a high school physical education student accurately and precisely? And the accurate and precise is measuring preparedness or readiness to train. Okay, I want to be pretty clear with my variables there. So can the high school student measure readiness and preparedness? And I think a lot of that's going to come through establishing the proper definitions and then the proper scale that addresses those definitions. So our hypothesis is that, and we have three of them, a high school student can accurately assess wellness. A secondary hypothesis is that the wellness scores will associate with preparedness and readiness. And then our third hypothesis is that students can do this reliably over the course of multiple time points. So let's look at assumptions and limitations. So some assumptions would be that the scale is appropriately curated for the high school student, right? It's valid and reliable, not only in terms of readiness and preparedness, but for this age group and for this specific population of physical education students. The second assumption would be that the students will adhere to the scale over time. We're going to give it over the course of several days. Can the students adhere to the scale protocol without falling off and giving inaccurate measurements, or let's just say becoming apathetic towards it? And then the third assumption is that these measurements will provide some value to the physical education process. A lot of this is predicated on the idea that Standard 3 integrates social and psychological concepts into physical activity. So what are some of the limitations? I think one of the limitations, one of the major ones, is going to be providing a concise scale for physical education students to stay engaged, but not omitting some of the psychological data that could be important. That could be a major limitation, because we are looking to provide a shorter scale, something that could be administered on a daily basis. Another limitation is going to be the decreased internal control of the experiment, being that's going to be given in an applied setting. The specificity to the demographic will also provide some limitations. And then the length of the investigation. As I mentioned earlier, one of the major shortcomings is longitudinal data, and through providing a validity study, it's going to be a short-term study. So the significance of this would be that there would be some emotional and psychological value added to physical education curriculum, as well as we would give students an emotional stake in the physical activity process. And the big one that I'm hoping to see here is that this study could, or this scale perhaps, could mitigate some of the apathy and indifference that we see in this particular population with respect to physical activity. Doesn't seem to be an important aspect of individuals' lives anymore. Or maybe it's just this age group, but I digress. Let's get into some of the bodies of literature. So I want to start with just looking at physical education for adolescents. So I provided a couple of studies in here from my first literature section. The first one I provided was a breakdown of the model content standards. And the model content standards, for those of you who don't teach PE or remember PE, is essentially a guide for how to build your curriculum for physical education. And this is created for K through 12th grade. For high school, there's particularly three main standards: demonstrating a knowledge, achieving a level of physical health that's notable for performance, and then the final standard that we are focusing on, which is demonstrating a knowledge of psychological and sociological concepts. And each of these have different substandards underneath that give you an idea of how you would apply these standards to your daily high school settings. Now, in high school, the standards are a little bit more advanced, rightfully so, because what you want is to illustrate the culmination of 8 years of physical education, and then essentially teach them how to take their physical activity, nutrition, cycle, and social health to the next level, so they can experience what they will want to do for the rest of their life. So you have 2 required years of PE, and then 2, what I like to call AP or advanced years of PE, where they can exercise completely different classes like weight training, like orienteering or outdoor adventure. It can go further into aquatics or water-based sports. It can go further into dual and individual sports. There is a plethora of options for students to take in those last 2 years of PE. So let's move forward to the Bailey 2006 study, which looked at illustrating some of the benefits and outcomes for physical education and sport when they are integrated in sports. And ultimately, he broke it down into 5 domains that physical education contributed to daily life. It was the physical domain, where it was able to improve just the physical aspects of life, such as getting the appropriate amount of physical activity, decreasing mortality factors, and improving physical health. There was the lifestyle factor, right? Teaching kids that physical activity should be a part of daily life and daily routine going forward into adulthood. There were the affective domains, which was being able to help the students improve well-being, self-esteem, reducing stress, anxiety, depression, using it as an emotional outlet or an emotional treatment for their daily life, as well as an emotional outlet to improve their daily life. There was the social domain, right? Becoming integrated within the community, contributing to groups, becoming a part of a group, having a feeling of being part of a group or a social network or a community. And then there was the cognitive domain, which showed that physical education had an impact on blood flow to the brain, enhancing the mood, increasing alertness. It has positive impact on standardized test scores and GPAs, which is not the point of this, but all of these areas show an improvement in physical education. Particularly what we're focused on is the affective and the social domains. The last part of that study that I want to point out was that Bailey indicated that the fundamentals that led to a successful school environment when PE and sport is included, they were having a positive environment, having diversity, having student engagement, having trained teachers and coaches, and having informed parents. So heavily relies on social support. And then the final study in the PE section is a review by Crushman, which looked at purposes and implications for physical education. Crushman, he labeled that curriculum, right, because we have standards, and our standards is what helps us establish our curriculum. And he tried to label that curriculum should address lifestyle behaviors, psychosocial factors, as well as moral behaviors. So he had several different categories where your curriculum should cover in order to not only address the standards, but address the whole child or build a holistic PE program. And he boiled it down a little bit further to show that PE should provide prescriptions for physical activity at a minimum, right? Students should understand what types of activities they should be doing, how long they should be doing them. It should reflect values for health, as well as enjoyment, challenge, self-expression, social interaction, which are those affective domain elements again, and social domain elements. And then leading back into the lifestyle elements, he said that PE should push for lifetime fitness, or it should influence lifetime fitness, at least. So, with that first body of literature, we're already starting to see how a wellness questionnaire or a readiness questionnaire could play into making exercise influenced by an internal choice, I guess I want to say, rather than an external choice. Because what we're ultimately looking for here is students to be able to judge whether they're prepared to participate in PE for the day. So let's look at the second body of literature, which addresses adolescence and then perceived wellness, So the first one by Spurt et al. Actually took place in a healthcare facility, and it was a study that was created to help nurses address wellness in adolescent populations. This was a 63-question survey, and some of the outcomes that they discovered here were higher wellness scores associated with perceptions of physical activity and nutrition, so increased physical activity and quality of nutrition. We had higher wellness with perceived importance of spirituality, particularly the adolescents were saying belief in a higher power, and this belief in a higher power correlated with higher wellness scores, perceived self-esteem and worthiness, as well as perceived connectedness. The next study was by Ashley et al., and it took place in 2012. And this particular study tried to equate wellness scores to school connectedness in adolescents. So over 100 students participated in this study, which is what made it pretty impactful, I think. And they had over 70% participate and complete the responses. And they were able to establish a significant relationship between connectedness and wellness. Wellness in the study was defined as spiritual, mental, and physical and emotional balance. And the students identified with higher scores of wellness when the school provided opportunities for parent involvement. They provided opportunities for more stability when they had more caring adults around. They had more structured activities, more quality nutrition, and then more extracurricular activities in there, which could be, those extra PE courses, or they could be extra sports or just extra events around school. The third study in this section is by Rochelle et al., and it was produced in 2013. And the authors here were looking to establish a relationship between wellness scales and the specific definitions that the scales serve. This is a really interesting paper because ultimately what the authors decided was that each scale was particularly designed to be validated based on the specific definition of wellness. And they also found that there are very many definitions of wellness. So one of the things that the author tried to do here was just establish a universal definition around the WHO's definition, which is that it's a relationship between optimal achievement, and this would be optimal achievement in all those domains that we mentioned, right? So physical, affective, social, cognitive, lifestyle. So it's the merger between optimal achievement there and the optimal contributions in different life settings. And this could be, within your circle of friends, within your family, within your community, as well as within your country. So it's kind of the marriage between those two ideas that establishes wellness for someone. And so through this article, they went through a plethora of different scales that were made to measure wellness, including wellness evaluation of lifestyle, 5-factor wellness inventory, perceived wellness survey, life assessment questionnaire, the test well, the optimal living profile, the wellness inventory, the holistic wellness assessment, the adolescent wellness appraisal, the juvenile health and wellness survey, perceived wellness profile, and finally the wellness factor of Laffery Health Conception Scale. So once he laid out the idea that there is no gold standard in wellness and that all these wellness scales exist, he went back to discuss the shortcomings, which were that there's kind of a scarcity of validity and reliability of these scales as a universal standard, but more so in adolescence. We don't see a lot of these scales validated in adolescence. And he attributes that particularly to the lack of a gold standard for wellness. So let's finish off with the final study in this chapter, or in this section. This is the Adolescent and Wellness section. We're going to go to the Ahananu study from 2016, which looked at adolescents and their qualitative perceptions of specific wellness terms. And the terms they went through in this study were healthy living, lack of sickness and illness, physical care of oneself, mind and spiritual well-being, and healthy personality. These are South African high school students. They did it in a focus group setting, so 5 to 6 students at a time. And all they did was go around in a circle and ask the students what they thought the meaning of those specific terms were. Some of the common statements included a balanced life, healthy nutrition, exercising, avoiding stress, avoiding drugs and alcohol, absence of disease, ability to fight disease, being positive and prayerful, having acceptance, understanding and respect of oneself, and relating well to others. So overall, the student comments correlated appropriately with the different terms, and the authors concluded that adolescents, for the most part, were well informed about what concepts of wellness meant. And more so, professionals should take it a step further by integrating measurements of wellness into daily practices with adolescents. And these could be important in the preparation, design, integration, and evaluation of adolescent wellness programs. So it should be an important psychosocial characteristic and holistic characteristic in any physical activity program, particularly the one that we're trying to validate here. It should be appropriate, and it probably should be a daily practice in physical education if we're looking not just to meet the standards for PE, but also to build the child holistically to want to take these habits, physical activity habits, and continue them later in life. So let's take a look at the third section of literature, which is going to digress somewhat, but we want to look at performance now, right? We've looked at just wellness in adolescence. We've looked at what physical education should address. Now we want to look at what are the physical determinants of wellness before we progress to what are the perceived wellness determinants for performance. So we have 4 studies that I broke down here for objective wellness and performance. The first is the Sawchuk investigation in 2018, which looked at sleep, recovery, training, and counter movement jumps in adolescent athletes. So in this particular study, we had 52 different sport youth athletes, and they just wanted to look at the objective relationship between measurements of counter movement jump. So let me go back there. Objective measurements of counter movement jump and perceptual measurements of sleep, recovery, and training load, right? And so with these athletes, over the course of 7 weeks, they had them wake up prior to the first session, fill out their little wellness questionnaire, do their counter movement jump for the first 4 days of the week, and then they recorded that over the course of the 7 weeks. And after 7 weeks, what they found was there was no relation between counter movement jump and training load or sleep or wellness, which I thought was extremely interesting. But the wellness questionnaire correlated well with sleep and not training, which is not usual to some of the, compared to some of the research we'll see in the next couple studies. The perceived recovery scale correlated well with training, makes sense, but not sleep. Those two usually correlate, as we'll see in future studies here. And then perceived recovery was more sensitive to high and low training, but not moderate training. And the wellness questionnaire was sensitive to low sleep. So there was a lot of elements of this study that were all over the place. But what I found to be the most interesting part of this is this was meant to be somewhat of a study tying objective to subjective measures. And the researchers concluded that the counter movement jump was not effective for monitoring anything in this study. In fact, they had everything they needed from looking at the sleep, the training, and the wellness questionnaires. And the wellness was only a few questions. The recovery was only a few questions. I thought what was really interesting was the training survey was just a combination of Borgs, and it was the modified Borg, the CR10, where it's a 1 to 10 scale. And what they did was after each training session, for the day, they just combined the scores, and that gave them the perceived training load for the day. So that was the first time I've seen that. It kind of establishes an arbitrary number. for the individual. But yeah, ultimately, what they understood out of the study was that this objective measure of the counter movement jump was not effective in that student athlete or in that athlete population, youth athlete population. The second study by Travis in 2018 looked at objective monitoring tools in adolescent weightlifters. This one was a little more objective than the last because there were no subjective measures. They wanted to look at squat jumps, counter movement jumps, and a relatively newer, I'd say in the last 10 to 20 years, isometric mid-thigh pulls for monitoring weightlifters over the course of a competitive season. So they took 52 weightlifters in this study as well, similar to the last one where they had 52 athletes. This one had males and females, and they had a broad range of performance levels. So you had beginners or class 1, what they consider in weightlifting, all the way up to master of sport, which would be the expert level. And after their Pearson correlations, what they were able to determine was the variable most associated with performance and probably most reliable for monitoring these athletes was the squat jump. They achieved significance in the squat jump, whereas they did not achieve any significance, or sorry, not significance. They didn't achieve any a large enough correlation in the counter movement jump as well as the isometric mid-thigh pull, which, just to point out here, I thought was interesting again because the counter movement jump has largely been one of the most widely used tests for central nervous system monitoring. Whereas in this particular population, weightlifters, it seems like the squat jump was a more specific, more valid, more reliable test for those individuals. And so building off the last two sections of literature, what I want us to start realizing here is that this idea of wellness, objective or subjective, is starting to become very individualized. So let's look at the next study, which is by Franceschi in 2018. This was actually a case study, which is going to further support the last thing I stated, which is that as we move forward, everything becomes fine-tuned. It becomes funneled down to the individual. So this case study that Franceschi did was looking at 3 youth national level long jumpers, track and field athletes, and they did counter movement jumps on these athletes every week to determine their preparedness for competition. Now, within these 3 athletes, following them through the course of an indoor season, which is like January to March, so a few months, they had a preparatory and a competition phase, and they took preparatory values and then measured them against every competition week to look at the deviation or the change from their preparatory phase to each week at the competition phase. So you could argue that that's the wrong thing or not. There might be some issues there with that comparison. However, all 3 of the athletes showed completely different variations in their counter movement jump profiles. And all these athletes trained at least 2 to 4 days per week. They all did their testing at the beginning of each week. So it seems like methodologically the case study had pretty good control. Now, when they broke down the 3 athletes at the end of the season, what they found was when comparing the prep phases to the comp phases for jumping, athlete A showed no changes in the counter movement jump over the course of the season. So it essentially provided no monitoring data or no significant monitoring data for athlete A. Athlete B showed some moderate changes, and those moderate changes happened in week 8 and 10 throughout the course of the season. And then athlete C showed some large variations, particularly around week 7 and 9. And we can discuss what that means at another time, but I think it means that that shows when those athletes are ready for some type of certain peak, probably. And the author concluded that counter movement jumps could be an appropriate tool to assess readiness in this population, and it can individualize results. The final study in this section is from Callahan et al., and it was in 2021, and it looks at the relationship between counter movement jump profiles and mean velocity in the back squat. This study was done in professional rugby players, and I think it's a really neat study because it furthers the idea of individualizing training and individualizing monitoring, which, again, not to keep repeating myself, but that is the message here. Validating a scale that's going to help individuals understand if they're prepared to perform, if they're ready to perform. So in this study, what they did is they had a rugby match, and then 30 minutes post-match, they did a quick little back squat assessment and counter movement jump assessment. And then 24 hours later, they did another assessment, same two, counter movement jump back squat. And then at 48 hours, they did an assessment. And their goal was just to look at fatigue over the course of time post-match and see if one could predict preparedness compared to the other, one being counter movement jump, the other one being back squat mean velocity. And they were particularly interested in the preparedness of the neuromuscular system to begin training again. So what they found was there were significant decreases in back squat mean velocity up to 48 hours after the match. And with the counter movement jump, it was significantly reduced up to 24 hours, but then returned to baseline at 48 hours. So different profiles there already. There were correlations between the CMJ and the back squat at 30 minutes and 48 hours post-match. But with a more unique profile, I think, that this study gave in back squat mean velocity, the authors concluded that the back squat mean velocity could be more suitable as an alternative unless you have the time to add it in with counter movement jumps for assessing the neuromuscular fatigue, because the back squat seemed to be a more common fundamental pattern for rugby players, as well as it's a very common tool used in rugby, very common training tool that they use in the weight room, if not daily, a few times a week to prepare themselves for matches. So now that we've looked at objective wellness and how that can be monitored with respect to performance, we're going to go into perceived wellness and how that can be monitored to ultimately predict readiness or preparedness. So the first study that we broke down in here is by Kelman. It's in 2010, and it was more of a narrative as it related to, and it related to stress recovery, and then looking at under recovery versus overtraining. So in this study, Kelman broke down quite a few scales. So he looked at the profile of mood states, the Borg's rating of perceived exertion, and then he compared them to the recovery stress questionnaire for athletes. I think another one he threw in there was the total quality recovery. So he had about 3 alternative scales that he compared to the scale that he was writing most of the article on, which was the REST-Q, or the Rest Recovery Questionnaire for athletes. And this was about a 60-point questionnaire, Likert scale 1 to 5, and he wanted to show the data that he had already collected on junior elite athletic populations with events like triathlon, swimming, soccer, rugby. He had a specific section talking about rowing and how this was a very good scale for monitoring rowers. And after explaining all of his data over the course of a season, he was able to show that there was some evidence that deemed the scale suitable for tracking progressions and tracking overtraining throughout the course of a season in those particular athletic events. And he also wanted to show that the application of psychological scales with physiological scales can provide all of the interdisciplinary staff with tools to prevent under recovery or overtraining. So it was more of a narrative review leading into this section of how can psychological scales or just can psychological scales be valid in helping us understand preparedness and readiness to train or perform. The second study that we're going to break down in here is the McLean et al. Study from 2010, which looks at professional rugby players. And they did neuromuscular, hormonal, and perceptual profiles between 3 different match microcycles within one season. And let me explain that just a little bit. So the test, neuromuscular, was a counter movement jump. The psychological was a wellness questionnaire, wellness and fatigue questionnaire. And then the hormonal was a biochemical assay using saliva. And they did this after 3 matches, but they wanted to look at the effects of the length of recovery time between those matches. So they did one in between a 5-day recovery, one where there was a 7-day recovery between matches, and then one where there was a 9-day recovery between matches. And one of the things they looked at with training loads, or found with training loads, was that there were significantly higher training loads in the 7 and 9-day microcycles, and there was a significantly lower training load in the 5-day microcycle. So here are some of the things that they found after they analyzed all of their data. The counter movement jumps tended to improve throughout the length of each microcycle between games. So as they got closer to, as they got further away from that post-match and closer to the next match, the counter movement jumps would get better. Interestingly, the perceived fatigue and soreness, the wellness perception questionnaire, that at about 4 days post-match, all returned back to baseline. It did not matter if it was the 5, the 7, or the 9-day microcycle. And the hormone assays showed no difference between the 5, the 7, and the 9-day microcycle, which is also kind of interesting. So the authors illustrated here that psychological questionnaires, as well as counter movement jumps, could be good for monitoring fatigue in professional rugby players, and that ultimately what this study teaches us is that psychological surveys are a cost-effective way of being able to understand and monitor fatigue. If anybody's ever done hormone assays, those can get extremely expensive. The next study is going to be by Gaston et al. In 2013, and they were looking at validating a professional practice that was already taking place in Australian football players, and this practice was using perceived wellness questionnaires daily. So I guess this is a common practice in Australian footballers, and I've seen this in basketball as well. This is just speaking from personal experience as well as speaking with colleagues who work for rugby teams. It's very common for some of these perceptual scales to take place on a daily basis, and then they use the data to best inform their practices, but a lot of times it doesn't get published because there's not enough time to publish when you're working 24 hours a day for a team. So for this study, the authors wanted to understand if perceptions of wellness can change weekly, if they can reflect fatigue in scores, and if they can be affected by age or performance, as well as affect playing performance, right? Because all of this comes down to we're trying to understand readiness and preparedness. So they looked at 27 senior level Australian football players, and they were gathering wellness information on measurements like what's your fatigue, what's your muscle pain, what is the hamstring strain, what's your quadriceps strain, what's your pain and stiffness, what is your full body power feel like, what is your sleep quality, what is your stress level, and then what is your well-being. And they use a Likert scale again on this one, 1 to 5. They had some preseason objective measures to compare these two. They do a 3K time trial and a 40-meter sprint as well. And then they had a couple other descriptives that they wanted to try and draw correlations to, like time, age, height, weight, speed, running endurance, and then experience. So after the season, some of the findings include that the experienced players, so people with 2 or more years of experience, they were able to handle the season well, and this reflected in their wellness scores. Also, the pain and stiffness, as well as sleep quality, had the highest average scores. Quad strain, stress, and wellness had the lowest average scores. They found that wellness improved as they got closer to each game day. And they found that faster players have a higher rating for strain and power post-match. It also revealed that fatigue, strain, and well-being improved over the course of the season. Fatigue, pain, power, and sleep significantly improved following a week with no game, and that older players had more issues with sleep quality post-game. So they found out a lot of interesting situations here again, further validating our claim that not only there is a need for this type of measurement in most individuals who are participating in physical activity, but that it's highly individualized. So in the researchers in this paper, as well as all the other ones, they similarly go on to conclude that wellness questionnaires were effective for being able to determine the daily readiness, the daily preparedness for training, as well as competition, and they provide a lot of great individualized data for their players. So the final study in this section is the one that actually turned me on to this topic. It's the McGahan et al. Study from 2019, and it illustrates a relationship between training load and readiness to train. And they did this in Gaelic football players, so soccer players in our language, and they used this as a pre-competition training camp tool, just as a daily measurement to understand how their players were responding to the training. There were 30 players in this study, and they looked at total distance and high-speed running using a GPS unit, which is very common in soccer and rugby. They looked at counter movement jumps, and then they looked at readiness to train through that, one of the similar psychometric questionnaires during practices leading up to the match. So, unfortunately, there weren't any significant differences measured, but they did identify a trend that lower readiness to train scores were correlated with individuals who had higher player loads. So player load is a metric that is derived from those GPS units, because most of those GPS units have accelerometers in them, triaxial accelerometers, and the different vectors, the combination of different vectors over the course of time of a training session can give you this somewhat arbitrary, somewhat useful training load or player load, which is supposed to indicate an intensity of the practice, or furthermore can give you kind of an objective rating for someone's load that was obtained during the practice. It's really easy to obtain a load in the weight room or running on a treadmill or even doing aerobic exercise. It's kind of easy to derive loads. But when it comes to, sport and game practices, it becomes challenging. And this is one of the ways that they've mitigated that challenge. And so this player load correlated with lower wellness scores or lower preparedness scores, indicating that psychologically the athletes were able to perceive that they weren't as ready when their body also registered an objective measurement showing that they weren't ready, maybe for a heavy practice or for a moderate practice. Maybe they needed a lighter practice the next day because they were able to indicate on both the objective and subjective fronts that they were hurting or that they were fatigued. So, the study is very, very straightforward. It essentially establishes that relationship between mileage and high-speed running, or that somewhat objective player load, and then the rate of perceived exertion, which resulted in readiness to train, or lack of readiness to train. And so the authors conclude that these multiple tools, GPS, counter movement jump, and perception, should be used to monitor athletes during pre-competition training camps as well. So just to return back to the topic, remember this is literature review for the dissertation that's going to be addressing the topic of establishing and validating a wellness questionnaire that's able to predict or help students predict preparedness and readiness to train. And these students will be of high school physical education demographic. Thank you for joining me today. I know it was a long one, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.